Okay, folks, I have really bad news for you. There's probably going to be another episode about libertarianism. I swear to God, I'm not a libertarian myself. And I really want this episode to be the last one dedicated to this particular topic. So I was going through my notes that I made before recording the first episode, and in the notes there was this weird word that I think is pronounced as Demoktesis. I didn't do any research about whatever this is because I kind of forgot to go through my notes, to be quite honest. Yeah, I was going with the flow. So I started reading this, and I immediately realized that this is something interesting. We're going to kick this mini episode with this question on philosophy.stackexchange.com. What does Nozick exactly say in his Demoktesis argument? We met this person in the previous episode, but we never actually looked this person up or tried to figure out what their agenda is. The only thing that we know is that SEK3 called the followers of Nozick's philosophy Nazis. There is a quote from Wikipedia. Demoktesis is a thought experiment designed to show the incompatibility of democracy with libertarianism in general and the entitlement theory specifically. I don't know what the entitlement theory is. We're going to look it up. We're going to ask ChatGPT about that. But first, we're going to finish reading this quote from Wikipedia. People who want to have more money might hit upon the idea of incorporating themselves, raising money by selling shares in themselves. First of all, what the fuck? Secondly, yeah, I guess libertarianism is alright with economic activities such as this. Anyway, so they would partition such rights as which occupation one would have. Though perhaps no one sells themselves into utter slavery, a very extensive domination of some persons by others arises through voluntary exchanges. It says here, no one sells himself into utter slavery. I think this was happening a lot in the Eastern Slavic states at around 9th century, 10th century. This is basically how the whole institution of serfdom was built. People were getting into debts and they were selling themselves into slavery to pay those debts back. So, extensive domination of some person by others. This intolerable situation is avoided by writing new terms of incorporation that for any stock, no one already owning more than a certain number of shares may purchase it. So once again, for any stock, no one already owning more than a certain number of shares may purchase it. So like you can be the majority holder of a certain stock, I guess. As the process goes on, everyone sells off rights in themselves, keeping one share in each right as their own, so they can attend stockholders' meetings if they wish. The inconvenience of attending such meetings leads to a special occupation of stockholders' representative. There is a great dispersal of shares such that almost everybody is deciding about everybody else. The system is still unwieldy, so a great consolidational convention is convened for buying and selling shares. And after several days, each person owns exactly one share in each right over every other person, including themselves. So now there can be just one meeting in which everything is decided for everybody. Attendance is too great and it's boring, so it's decided that only those entitled to cast at least 100,000 votes may attend the grand stockholders' meeting. The social theorists call the system Demoktesis, from Greek demos, and ktesis, which is people ownership. Ownership of the people, by the people, and for the people, and declare it the highest form of social life, one that must not be allowed to perish from the earth. First of all, come on, this is interesting. You cannot argue with this. There is people selling shares of themselves to other people, and somehow this all converges in a democracy. So here is the question that the original poster has. Okay, we arrive with a situation similar to the modern democratic state at the end. They decided to incorporate themselves, sold shares of themselves, and because there was burden of attendance, representatives are formed, and they decide. So what this seems to imply is that democracy can be formed out of libertarianism. Or is Nozick saying that as humans are by themselves means, this contrasts with libertarian aims? So there is a lot to unpack here, and the problem here is that the only serious answer to this question does not make things more clear. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this answer and then we're going to try to untangle this. So this person says that they would understand this as the formation of a state in the same vein as Hobbes' Leviathan and the Rousseau's theory of the general will in social contract theory. Just a side note, I have read Leviathan, but I did not read Rousseau. So Hobbes argues for an absolute sovereign state, and this is the Leviathan, whereas Rousseau argues for a more egalitarian possibility. Notably, Rousseau was writing during the French Revolution, where pure democracy became a live issue, as opposed to the constitutional compromise of the English parliamentarian system that evolved after the English Civil War. So one could say that Nozick has simply updated Rousseau's state found in myth in his short book The Social Contract to the context of a libertarian social contract theory. The Social Contract is a book by Jean-Jacques Rousseau that was published in 1762. The book theorizes about the best way to establish a political community in the face of the problems of commercial society. The social contract helped inspire political reforms or revolutions in Europe, especially in France. The social contract argued against the idea that monarchs were divinely empowered to legislate. Yeah, this is probably not the problem that we're dealing with at this particular moment in time, but it seems like Jean-Jacques Rousseau was one of the people who actually helped us overcome this misconception. So this book offers a theory of political legitimacy and an exploration of sovereignty, focusing on the idea of a social contract that forms the basis of civil society. The founding myth within the social contract is the idea of the noble savage, a hypothetical human being living in a state of nature. This person is unaffected by society and lives in pure freedom, but without any protection against others. The state of nature is ideal in terms of freedom, but is filled with constant danger. Rousseau describes how people seeking mutual protection and stability willingly surrender their individual freedoms to a collective body, forming a society. This leads to the core concept of the book, the social contract. Rousseau suggests that people form a contract with one another to live in a society that guarantees mutual protection. In this contract, individuals surrender all their rights and freedoms to the collective body, which is the sovereign. The sovereign, representing the will of people, has the sole right to legislate and regulate behavior. So to summarize this, in the context of the social contract, the founding myth is the creation of civil society through this hypothetical social contract out of the chaotic and dangerous state of nature where individuals lived as noble savages. Lovely. Let's now proceed with the response to the original question. One curious feature of the extract you quoted is that Nozick starts by stating that libertarianism is not consistent with democracy. And they quote, "Demoktesis is a thought experiment designed to show the incompatibility of democracy with libertarianism in general and the entitlement theory specifically." But then he goes on to propose a pseudo-myth that does exactly this. So how do I see this? There is a book by Nozick where this Demoktesis argument was first published. And it seems like this book is very interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find out what the name of the book is, and I'll try to explore its contents. Easy. The book is called Anarchy, State and Utopia, and it was published in 1974. Okay, Jesus Christ, there is like a huge Wikipedia article about this book. Does it say anything about Demoktesis? Yes, it does, and it's actually the same snippet that we read on Stack Exchange. It's not quite clear, though, why Nozick has to come up with this thought experiment in the context of this book. I have something very special here. It's Encyclopedia Britannica, and it has an article about Robert Nozick with a whole section dedicated to anarchy, state, and utopia. And I think that in this particular case, we're not going to use ChatGPT to explore this book. So it says here that during his high school and college years, Nozick was a member of the student New Left and an enthusiastic socialist. But then he read a couple of libertarian books, and his political views began to change. His conversion to libertarianism culminated in 1974 with the publication of Anarchy, State, and Utopia, a closely argued and highly original defense of the libertarian minimal state and a critique of the social democratic liberalism of his Harvard colleague John Rawls. It says here that the book was immediately hailed by conservative intellectuals and became a kind of a philosophical manifesto of the new right, and that Nozick himself was not comfortable with this association. It would probably be nice to know who the conservative intellectuals were in 1974. We do know that nowadays conservative intellectuals are represented in the media by such outstanding thinkers as Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson. But it's not quite clear what the state of affairs was in 1974 in this regard. Okay, back to business. So the main purpose of Anarchy, State, and Utopia is to show that the minimal state, and only the minimal state, is morally justified. By a minimal state, Nozick means a state that functions essentially as a night watchman. This is something that we read about minarchism, right? With powers limited to those necessary to protect citizens against violence, theft, and fraud. By arguing that the minimal state is justified, Nozick seeks to refute anarchism, which opposes any state whatsoever. By arguing that no more than the minimal state is justified, Nozick seeks to refute modern forms of liberalism, as well as socialism and other leftist ideologies, which contend that, in addition to its powers as a night watchman, the state should have the powers to regulate the economic activities of citizens, to redistribute wealth in the direction of greater equality, and to provide social services such as education and healthcare. Against anarchism, Nozick claims that a minimal state is justified because it, or something very much like it, would arise spontaneously among people living in a hypothetical state of nature through transactions that would not involve the violation of anyone's natural rights. Following the 17th century English philosopher John Locke, Nozick assumes that everyone possesses the natural rights to life, liberty, and property, including the right to claim as property the fruits or products of one's labor, and the right to dispose of one's property as one sees fit, provided that in doing so one does not violate the rights of anyone else. Everyone also has the natural right to punish those who violate or attempt to violate one's own natural rights. Because defending one's natural rights in a state of nature would be difficult for anyone to do on their own, individuals would band together to form protection associations in which members would work together to defend each other's rights and to punish rights violators. Eventually, some of these associations would develop into private businesses offering protection and punishment services for a fee. The great importance that individuals would attach to such services would give the largest protection firms a natural competitive advantage, and eventually only one firm or a confederation of firms would control all the protection and punishment business in the community. And exactly because this confederation of firms would have a monopoly of force in the territory, it would constitute a minimal state in the libertarian sense. And against liberalism and ideology's farther left, Nozick claims that no more than the minimal state is justified because any state with more extensive powers would violate the natural rights of citizens. Thus, the state should not have the power to control prices or to set a minimum wage, because doing so would violate the natural rights of citizens to dispose of their property, including their labor, as they see fit. So I do not completely understand this argument because he says that there is a set of natural rights that all people possess. Those are the natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and the fruits of one's labor. And another natural right, which is to punish those who violate or attempt to violate one's own natural rights. Now, what he's saying is that it's going to be so hard to execute your natural right to punish the violators of other natural rights on your own that eventually you're going to transfer those rights to private firms and basically abandon those rights. And for some reason, he assumes that this is the only natural right that can and should be transferred to private companies. But the same logic can be applied to creating social safety nets, such as looking after the disabled or the elderly ones, which we can probably interpret as disposing of your own property, because you're basically giving your property to those who need it more. And it seems like you can make the same argument here, that doing that on your own can be too time consuming and just too hard. So people are going to outsource that portion of their rights to private organizations that are going to do that job for them. And those organizations are going to naturally grow larger and larger, and eventually they might just merge with the organizations that provide security services to the population. Does that sound insane? I don't know. Moving on. So the bad news for us is that there is no mentions of Demoktesis in this whole article, right? But I think it makes sense to first read a nice article about the book on the Encyclopedia Britannica, and then to ask ChatGPT to explain to us why Nozick had to make this Demoktesis argument in the first place. So as we already know, in this book, Nozick was polemizing with Rawls, and Rawls argues that the state should have whatever powers are necessary to ensure that those citizens who are least well off are as well off as they can be, though these powers must be consistent with a variety of basic rights and freedoms. And this viewpoint is derived from Rawls' theory of justice. So I assume that all of these people, Nozick, Rawls, they are what we call the deontological libertarians. If you do not know what deontological libertarianism is, I recommend you to watch the previous video on libertarianism on this channel. So Rawls' theory of justice that states that an unequal distribution of wealth and income is acceptable only if those at the bottom are better off than what they would be under any other distribution. What the fuck does that mean? Unequal distribution of wealth and income is acceptable only if those at the bottom are better off than they would be under any other distribution. I have to admit, I do not understand what this means. I feel like a complete moron about this, but I actually asked ChatGPT to help me out here, and I might be wrong, but this seems to be a very nice answer that actually helped me. So, the other distributions referred to here could mean any other possible arrangement of income and wealth in a society. Rawls argues that the inequalities in wealth and income are only justified if they work to the advantage of the least advantaged group in the society. The first one is everyone has the exact same amount of wealth, perfect equality. And the second one is some people have more more wealth than others, but the overall wealth of the society is higher, including that of the poorest individuals. And so Rawls would argue that the second distribution is more just than the first one, even though it's more unequal. Okay, so as I understand this is basically an argument against communism. So an example of that would be Soviet Union, I guess, where the distribution of wealth was more even, but everybody was equally poor. It is, of course, a very low quality example because I think that multiple factors contributed to the low standard of living in the Soviet Union. But I think you get the idea. This is very interesting. This is the first time when I was completely lost reading a text and ChatGPT actually helped me. The other issue, of course, is that we do not know whether or not this is the correct answer to the question that I had, but it is a very compelling one. And the name of the channel is the Misinformation Machine. So I guess I'm just happy with what I have, and we're going to move on. Okay, so once again, unequal distribution of wealth and income is acceptable only if those at the bottom are better off than they would be under any other distribution. Nozick's response to such arguments is to claim that they rest on a false conception of distributive justice. They wrongly define a just distribution in terms of the pattern it exhibits at a given time, e.g. an equal distribution or a distribution that is unequal to a certain extent, or in terms of the historical circumstances surrounding its development, e.g. those who worked the hardest have more, rather than in terms of the nature of the transactions through which the distribution came about. So for Nozick, any distribution of holdings, as he calls them, no matter how unequal, is just if it arises from a just distribution through legitimate means. One legitimate means is the appropriation of something that is unowned in circumstances where the acquisition would not disadvantage others. A second means is the voluntary transfer of ownership of holdings to someone else. And the last one is the rectification of past injustices in the acquisition or transfer of holdings. According to Nozick, anyone who acquired what he has through these means is morally entitled to it. Thus, the entitlement theory of justice states that the distribution of holdings in a society is just if and only if everyone in that society is entitled to what he has. I'm not going to immediately comment what I've read because I think that we're going to see something interesting in the next paragraph. To show that the theories of justice based on patterns or historical circumstances are false, Nozick devised a simple but ingenious objection which came to be known as the Will Chamberlain argument. By the way, this fucking website is just full of weird ads, and when it switches from one ad to another, they somehow change the layout of the article. I mean, it sucks. Back to the Will Chamberlain argument. Assume, Nozick says, that the distribution of holdings in a given society is just according to some theory based on patterns or historical circumstances. For example, the egalitarian theory, according to which only a strictly equal distribution of holdings is just. In this society, Will Chamberlain is an excellent basketball player and many teams compete with each other to engage his services. Chamberlain eventually agrees to play for a certain team on the condition that everyone who attends a game in which he plays puts 25 cents in a special box at the gate, the contents of which will go to him. Okay, I'm very intrigued. I want to know where this is going. During the season, 1 million fans attend the team's games, and so Chamberlain receives $250,000. But now, the supposedly just distribution of holdings is upset because Chamberlain has $250,000 more than everyone else. And here arises the question, is the new distribution unjust? The strong intuition that it is not unjust is accounted for by Nozick's entitlement theory, because Chamberlain acquired his holdings by legitimate means. But it conflicts with the egalitarian theory. Nozick contends that his argument generalizes to any theory based on patterns or historical circumstances, because any distribution dictated by such a theory could be upset by ordinary and unobjectionable transactions like the one involving Chamberlain. And so Nozick concludes that any society that attempted to implement such a theory would have to intrude grossly on the liberty of its citizens in order to enforce the distribution that it considers just. And he says that the socialist society would have to forbid capitalist acts between consenting adults. Exactly what I just said. This is all anti-communist propaganda. And to conclude, Nozick emphasizes that his vision of the minimal state is inclusive and is compatible with the existence of smaller communities based on varying theories of justice. Okay, I'll tell you what I think about this. It reminds me a lot of the early formal theories of natural language. Those theories were very naive, and what they tried to achieve was to come up with a very compact set of rules, or axioms if you want, that would allow you to correctly describe any natural language grammar. The problem that they ran into was that natural languages resisted such simplifications very well, and so they had to add more and more simple rules to the original set to account for the ever-growing variability of things that natural languages allowed. And at some point, in my opinion, this set became just ridiculously huge and the whole thing was not fun anymore. Maybe I'm wrong, but here I see something very similar. This whole argument sort of assumes that all transactions in the world are as easy as putting 25 cents into a box, which is obviously not true. Let's ask ChatGPT to give us a counter-argument. So there are several ways to argue with this. We're going to briefly go through each of them. The first one is the assumption of a fair starting point. Nozick's argument assumes a fair initial distribution of wealth, and in reality, this is not the case. Wealth is often initially distributed unequally due to systemic factors such as generational wealth, economic class, and social opportunity. The second thing is the exploitation. Nozick's argument assumes that all transactions are made freely and without coercion. However, in practice, many people might be forced to accept low wages or poor working conditions due to the circumstances beyond their control, such as poverty, lack of education, or systemic discrimination. And in such cases, the transactions, of course, are not truly voluntary. Now, there is this next argument with a very intriguing title, negative externalities. Nozick does not take into account the costs that are borne by third parties that are not involved in the transaction. What does it mean? For instance, a corporation might become extremely wealthy by polluting the environment, causing harm to everyone who breathes the air or drinks the water. Yeah, exactly. It's more complicated than putting 25 cents into a box. Come on. Next, we have the community and interdependence argument. Nozick emphasizes individual rights and transactions, but underestimates the role of community and interdependence in wealth creation. For example, a wealthy person might rely on public infrastructure, social stability, an educated workforce, etc., which are all products of communal investment in social structures. Last issue is the issue of merit. The argument presumes that people are always rewarded in proportion to their merit, whereas in the real world, luck, birth circumstances, market dynamics, and other factors play a significant role in one's wealth accumulation, thus questioning the ethical justification of wealth inequality. What do you think about this? I think that ChatGPT is doing a great job today. Maybe he got jealous that we read the Britannica article this whole episode. There is two things that we yet have to do. The first thing is we're going to ask ChatGPT about why Nozick had to make the Demoktesis argument in his book. And secondly, I want to ask ChatGPT about the beef that SEK3 had with Robert Nozick. As we remember, SEK3 called Nozick's followers Nazis. Let's hope that ChatGPT is going to help us out here. I hate to tell you this, but we do have a problem. The problem is that ChatGPT refuses to acknowledge the fact that Anarchy State and Utopia does have a chapter that is called Demoktesis, and so it refuses to tell us anything about this chapter. And in particular, it doesn't tell us why Nozick had to come up with this thought experiment at all. So unfortunately, I had to actually go and read this chapter. It's unfortunate because I really wanted to avoid doing that. But here we are. Now, if you think that if you read this chapter, you'll get answers to all of your questions, you're wrong. Because this chapter is very weird from the very beginning to the very end. To give you an idea of the place of this chapter in this book, Nozick has just finished proving that minimal state is better than no state and is much better than a leftist state. And he wants to do some due diligence. His whole idea of justice, in a nutshell, is that a state of affairs can be considered to be just only and only if it was achieved through a series of just actions. So this is a procedural theory of justice. We saw an illustration of that in the Will Chamberlain example. Once again, for Nozick, any state of affairs is just if it was reached through a series of just actions, even if this state of affairs includes inequality and other bad things. So in the Demoktesis chapter, what Nozick tries to do is he tries to figure out whether or not it's possible to start with a minimal state and through a series of just actions arrive at a more than minimal state, which Nozick thinks to be bad. And the funny thing here is that he shows that it is actually possible to get there. The summary of the Demoktesis myth that we read at the beginning of this episode is actually very, very nice. So I am not going to repeat it here to avoid wasting anyone's time. I don't think that this is a surprise to anyone at this point, but Demoktesis is actually democracy as we understand it nowadays. So what happened here is we derived a democratic society from a minimal state society through a series of just actions, which allows me to assume that for Nozick, democracy is a just social order. But it is exactly here when this chapter starts to get weird, because Nozick kinda avoids discussing the conclusion that we just arrived at. Instead, he decides to tell us the tale of the slave, which is another very short thought experiment that I'm going to read for you. Indeed, Nozick says, we have arrived at a democratic state. Our hypothetical account of how it might arise from a minimal state without any blatant violation of anyone's rights has placed us in a better position to focus upon and ponder the essential nature of such a state and its fundamental mode of relationship among persons. For what it's worth. What does that mean? How should I interpret this? What sort of a conclusion is this? I don't know. If you understand this, please leave a comment. Anyways, right after saying this, he goes, other tales, some of unjust origins, also might be told. Consider the following sequence of cases, which we shall call the tale of the slave, and imagine it is about you. All of the cases are numbered and they go from 1 to 9. The first case, there is a slave completely at the mercy of his brutal master's whims. He often is cruelly beaten, called out in the middle of the night, and so on. Next case. The master is kindlier and beats the slave only for stated infractions of his rules, that is, not fulfilling the work quota, and so on. Also, the master gives the slave some free time. Moving on. The master has a group of slaves and he decides how things are to be allocated among them on nice grounds, taking into account their needs, merits, and so on. Next phase. The master allows his slaves 4 days on their own and requires them to work only 3 days a week on his land. The rest of the time is their own. Fifth case. The master allows his slaves to go off and work in the city or anywhere they wish for wages. He requires only that they send back to him 3/7 of their wages. He also retains the power to recall them to the plantation if some emergency threatens his land, and to raise or lower the 3/7 amount required to be turned over to him. He further retains the right to restrict the slaves from participating in certain dangerous activities that threaten his financial return, for example, mountain climbing, cigarette smoking, etc. So I guess you now understand where this is going. We are going to arrive eventually at a democratic state. Let's see how this happens. The master allows all of his 10,000 slaves except you to vote, and the joint decision is made by all of them. There is open discussion and so forth among them, and they have the power to determine to what uses to put whatever percentage of your and their earnings they decide to take, what activities legitimately may be forbidden to you, and so on. And in the next 3 steps, he basically finalizes this whole voting idea until you get the actual democratic state. And he finishes with the question, which transition from case 1 to case 9 made it no longer the tale of a slave? Now, what on earth is that supposed to mean? What is the message of the Demoktesis chapter of Anarchy, State, and Utopia? Once again, we start with deriving democracy from a minimal state through just actions, and then we show that the same democratic society can be reached through 9 easy steps from a slave-owning society. My dear viewer, how would you interpret the message sent by this chapter? I'm getting mixed signals. I think that in the original question on Stock Exchange, they thought that the goal of this chapter is to show that democracy is not compatible with libertarianism. But I don't see it here. What I do see here is a little bit of a self-own, because if Nozick doesn't like the current state of affairs, which is a democratic state, and he thinks that his system of minimal government and the procedural theory of justice is much better than democracy, then this Demoktesis thing is probably not a nice place to find yourself at. I have to admit that there is another very short section that is called Hypothetical Histories that might explain to us what's going on here. But the problem with this section is that it's really hard to read and to understand. I promise you, try to read this, you'll see it yourself. I asked ChatGPT to summarize this section for us in simple terms, and so let's see how much this helps. Nozick also considers the impact of hypothetical histories on our judgment of a society's structure. Just a side note, if I understand this correctly, then both the Demoktesis myth and the tale of the slave are 2 hypothetical histories. So if a society's actual history is just, then the society is just. If its history is unjust and no hypothetical just history could have led to its current structure, then the structure is unjust. However, if an unjust society's actual history is close to a hypothetical just history, then the structure can be considered as just as one could reasonably expect. If the hypothetical just history requires everyone's consent, then if an actual person would not consent, the structure would be seen as unjust. The same applies if some people now wouldn't agree to others having consented in the past. Now, I think I have to mention here that we do not actually know the end of the Demoktesis myth. It doesn't end with us arriving at a democratic society. It actually goes a little bit further. Let's read the source. Occasionally, some people refuse to accept their great corporation shares and refuse to sign the Stockholders Guild scroll of membership. They say that they want no part of the system and refuse to grant the system any part of them. Several of them go as far as to call for the dismantling of the corporation. Some of the people on the board of directors call for their incarceration. Some members of the board maintain that by accepting the benefits of growing up under the wing of the corporation and by remaining in its area of influence, the youngsters have already tacitly consented to be share-held, and so no further act from them is needed. I think you get the idea. So I see a little bit of a connection here. Let's read this once again. If the hypothetical just history requires everyone's consent, then if an actual person person would not consent, the structure would be seen as unjust. And the next thing, the same applies if some people now wouldn't agree to others having consented in the past. To avoid any suspicions, let's read from the original now. Similarly, Nozick says, one must hold the institutional structure unjust if the hypothetical just history involves some people's consenting who didn't, and some now would not assent to those others having done so. My take is that this is a very shaky argument, because now you have to take into account what some people think about what other people thought when they consented to join a particular social order, which is definitely not what you want to do, especially if you are in favor of recursive theories of justice, such as Nozick's procedural justice theory. So as you can see, it's not immediately clear what to think about this chapter. And the other problem is that there is not that much on the internet about Demoktesis. Like, you actually cannot find any reasonable information about this. What I managed to find is this blog, which is not very informative because essentially this is a summary of the chapter. And this question on Reddit, which seems to be very reasonable, but this is just a question and there is no answers to it. I also tried to do some due diligence and I googled official peer-reviewed critiques of Nozick's Anarchy State and Utopia because I couldn't find any critique of the Demoktesis chapter specifically. One of the articles that I found you can see on the screen, but to be quite honest, it's not about Demoktesis at all, it's about other things. And if you Google Demoktesis on YouTube, you will find this one recording of a lecture dedicated to Nozick. And it's a very nice lecture, I liked it a lot, but unfortunately there is no mentions of Demoktesis in this lecture. So at this point, what I have to tell you, I think that I did my best. I think I've invested enough of my resources into this research, and what? At least now I know about 3 interesting thought experiments. The Will Chamberlain one, the Demoktesis thought experiment, and the Tale of the Slave thought experiment, right? This is a good outcome for all of us. Let's wrap this up. I think the last thing that I wanted to check is why SEK3 called Nozick followers Nazis. So SEK3, as a proponent of agorism, advocated for a completely stateless society and market actions outside of state control, known as counter-economics. Yeah, we know that. He viewed Nozick's minimal state as an unacceptable compromise that would inevitably lead to a growth in state power. The term Nazi can be seen as a reflection of these disagreements, implying in a tongue-in-cheek manner that Nozick's followers were as misguided or authoritarian as Nazis. Of course, this is a hyperbolic critique and not a serious comparison to the actual Nazi ideology. Yeah, I don't know what I was hoping for here. This whole thing is an example of Godwin's law, basically. Okay, I'm done with this. No more episodes about libertarianism. I've had enough. Press like, subscribe, and leave comments. Have a nice day.